terms is that the closer the contours, the steeper the property. So you can see that in reference there is a 7.5 acre triangular floodplain, historic floodplain bench down at the lower area adjacent to the highway. There is steeper contours here that rises about 40 feet up to an upper bench that's about 13 acres in size. And then the overall property is the 45 acres. And I wanted to point out when I was mentioning the trapezoid, this is the designated National Historic District. And an enlargement view, so we're kind of looking at two different scales as we've done our planning effort. And I'd like just to point out that the 4 significant existing structures is the caretaker's residence, the old hatchery building, what was a garage that in the 80s or 90s, Ken, was converted into the Chamber of Commerce Visitor Wayside Information Center. And then there is a barn that's on the upper left corner of that property. There are a few other structures, and I think the important thing, just a reference to the historic district, is that the district is the buildings, it's the fish pond, it's the canal system, it's the grove of fairly mature Douglas fir trees. So in terms of thinking about that designation that was made back in the 90s, it really related to thinking about the fish hatchery as a whole. And we'll come back to that when we summarize our meetings with SHPO in terms of what does that mean in terms of development for a visitor or interpretive center. I mentioned we also utilized Lane County's GIS system. We wanted to make sure we looked at 100-year floodplain. We are outside the McKenzie River floodplain, which was good news. Along Hatchery Creek, which is along the eastern edge of the property, there is a zone at the lower portion of the zone. We looked at landform and landslide hazards. The county has mapped potential landslide, can't get that out, landslide zones. And what you'll notice, just for reference in terms of thinking about development potential of the property, that bluff that separates the lower and the upper bench is also designated as a potential hazard zone. And a lot of that is just based upon the degree of slope. So the steeper the slope, the higher likelihood of landslide issues. We looked at comprehensive planning, and I think one of the things that was helpful to have Mike Russell here at the last workshop is that there are 2 zoning designations. The lower bench is zoned public facility, rural facilities, which in terms of thinking about implications for an interpretive visitor center, that would be an allowed use. The upper majority of the property is zoned forest property, and if we were to develop a building up there, it would take a rezone and a comprehensive plan change. But that became a non-issue because Mike mentioned that the county is in their cyclical cycle of revisiting zoning and comprehensive planning, and if we wanted to propose a use for that, the county was more than open to amend the code related to that. We looked at soils, and a lot of times soils relative to use and ability relates to more fine-grained soils that often are associated with wetlands. In this case, we found there were no issues. And we looked at wetlands, and the only wetlands were those associated with Hatchery Creek. So all of that exercise was really pointed at making sure that we had done our due diligence. We had looking for, were there any significant constraints that would limit where we might site buildings or parkings or interpretive trails? And the answer was, except for that bluff edge, there were very few constraints that we had to stay away from.
The most important constraint, of course, being the historic district, which they're adamant about retaining, and also the Doug firs.
Yes. So the other thing we did, I always like to tell the story that I think my favorite part of going to school, from grade school to high school, was going on field trips. And I often use that same experience experience to think about how do you start a project. So we began our project with about a 2-hour walk around the site. And there's just a few pictures if anyone needs their memory jogged or haven't been to the site. This is the caretaker's residence and the existing entry to the property off of the McKenzie River Highway. We were there on an absolute amazing day. It started off between 7:30 and 8:30, very fog and shroud. And at the moment of when we did a pre-walk before the group came, the fog parted and the sunlight came streaming through the Douglas fir forest that occupies the majority of that upper bench. And it really set the stage, I think, for thinking about some of the development or design criteria, that this was a very special place. And we had to be careful in terms of how we proposed development, or in the case you'll see in the recommended plan, generally staying away from significant intrusions in there to retain some of this character and experience that we had.
And you'll see that in the plans, this alley of trees and where they're walking is critical to the entrance to the building and the whole site. So this was an important visit that day to understand those qualities.
We walked by the pond, and I'm again referencing the historic district. The pond that became the source of water for the fish hatchery is also considered an important feature of the district. And then we had the opportunity when the sun came out where we all walked around looking at the hatchery building, the garage, Chamber of Commerce building. We all had the opportunity to walk. I think Ken was our primary tour guide that day and talked about how the hatchery functioned, and we had a chance to poke our noses into each of the buildings and get a sense of the place. I think that the largest part of our 3 days working here in October was the first day, which was an all-day workshop. And this was an exercise we called sliders, and you can see a number of faces or backs of heads from folks in the room, but we did a series of exercises talking really about aspirations for the project, vision, if there were concerns or constraints, or what were the greatest opportunities that people saw. And then we adjourned, and we had a day and a half as a 4-person design team, punctuated by a potluck or two with our core client group. But we actually spent that day and a half developing a more refined site analysis, and then 4 alternatives that we then presented on the afternoon of the 3rd day. And I think at that meeting we probably had about a dozen of the 35 who were able to come back. But I wanted to just point out, and Bill and I will now talk about, in summary fashion, what those 4 alternatives are as a lead-in to the recommended plan. The first thing we did is we looked at kind of summarizing the key elements of thinking about the site. And we summarized here on the right side that we looked at the context, and by that I mean the adjacent highway, the lake, the views out to the McKenzie River and Leeburg Lake we felt were really important. We knew that on the west side is our timberlands, and on the east side of the property are large lot residential areas, and that gave us some context of thinking about entry, and did we have neighbors, or were we wildlands along the perimeter. We defined the district boundary again, and I think in terms of some of the issues relative to thinking about alternatives, this bluff that separates the lower and upper terrace, the 40-foot slope and the embankment, I think becomes a key determinant of how the property was developed. And we really identified sort of that upper evergreen forest as a magical place and as a guide for our work. Many of us during the site walk followed the trail that was cleared up to the intake structure where the water is constraints or pros or cons of each one. And we gave a name to each of the alternatives. This first one we called the McKenzie Vista, and it was really generated by the idea that we were going to locate the visitor center on top of the bluff with expansive views out over the hatchery and out to the McKenzie River. What that necessitated was a new entry drive that would cross this bluff and then arrive at a parking lot for both passenger vehicles, but also thinking about boat trailers, RVs, and trailers. And the idea was that you arrived here at an entry complex, and the building complex was divided into three components that created a courtyard and framed that view out towards the river. As I mentioned, we identified some pros and cons. I think the big thing on this was that by going to the upper terrace, we had lots of land available to fit the program for the building, for the parking. We had these views. I think the significant cons that we identified were that it was going to be a significant environmental and cost issue